But these laws were so broad and so sweeping that they essentially covered talk therapy. They said you could not, as a psychological provider, you couldn't even talk to your clients about their gender identity or sexuality unless you were saying the things they wanted you to say about it. That's obviously a free speech issue.
Hey guys, Brad here, bringing you some bonus content. I recently went on Dr. Drew's live stream to discuss the Supreme Court case about conversion therapy, I should probably say that in air quotes, and why I think they ultimately came to the right decision, and a lot of the progressive rhetoric and doom-mongering about this issue is not actually borne out by the facts on the ground. I'm attaching that conversation right after this. Hope that you guys enjoy. Be sure to subscribe, like, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for tuning in, and here is my conversation with Dr. Drew.
So tell me about the Supreme Court and conversion therapy. What do we do with this?
Well, this is a huge Supreme Court case, and it's frankly kind of one that would have baffled me a couple of years ago thinking about it for a couple of reasons. I mean, the idea that two Democratic appointed Supreme Court justices would have actually agreed with the conservative majority to strike down LGBT rights, in air quotes there, legislation that bans conversion therapy, as they call it in Colorado. I mean, that would have been unthinkable to me a couple of years ago, that there would be that kind of cross-ideological agreement. And that should be the first sign to folks at home that this is not some crazy far-right Supreme Court decision that's going to start shocking the gay out of confused teenagers again. What this is instead is frankly common sense. I have actually, and it's been a little bit of a journey for me, because I've advocated for years that I do think anti-gay conversion therapy in terms of treatments like shock therapy and that kind of thing should be illegal. It doesn't work. And I think it's a fraudulent medical practice. But these laws were so broad and so sweeping that they essentially covered talk therapy. They said you could not, as a psychological provider, you couldn't even talk to your clients about their gender identity or sexuality unless you were saying the things they wanted you to say about it. That's obviously a free speech issue. And especially as it lumps in gender identity, it's almost malpractice to just blindly affirm whatever they tell you. But that was literally the law in Colorado that's now being sent back for review and will almost certainly be struck down.
Well, that part of the gender treatment or the transsexual community treatment is still, there's nobody that says anything other than affirmation. That's what I was talking to Brianna Wu about, is that's it. And even she and I talking about the nuances of, sorting out this broad category of transsexual and doing what's right for each individual so the outcomes are as good as possible. You can't even do that. Yeah, I'm probably going to get canceled for having that conversation. Somebody's going to come after me. And I just want to do good by people and make sure their outcomes are good, so we don't have people that are detransitioning or unhappy or made miserable. The only positive outcome is what I want to see. That's on my profession to do that as well as possible. But the what's it called? The conversion therapy. Conversion therapy, though, I mean, conversion therapy is a horror show, right? We can agree on that. Per se. Okay.
Oh, the old school conversion therapy
in all
its
forms. But it's sort of in all its forms, right? In kind of all its forms. However, to talk to a youth that is unclear about their sexual identity, that seems like routine adolescent care. That seems like just what you would do if an adolescent is distressed, right? And was that what was outlawed?
Yeah, so that's what I mean. The law defined conversion therapy so broadly that it went so far beyond the scope of anything you or I would have thought of as conversion therapy. What it said was that a therapist even talking to you and not affirming your gender. So say, for example, you have a 12-year-old that comes in that thinks they're non-binary is their gender identity. And I was listening to your conversation with Brianna, and I completely have always agreed with people like her living their lives, transitioning if they want, adults making their own informed choices. I will always believe that. But I'll never believe like in this whole idea of non-binary, and especially I'll never believe in it coming from a confused 12-year-old who just heard about it on TikTok. But this law defined it as illegal conversion therapy to tell that 12-year-old, you're not non-binary, you're a biological female. Talk to me about why you're feeling, or even if you just ask questions, it required you legislatively to affirm any identity presented. And look, I don't know the exact right way to handle a child with profound and persistent gender dysphoria. I don't believe they should be making any irreversible medical changes until they're adults. But I do know that any responsible clinician can't just blindly accept what a 10-year-old or 11-year-old is telling you without pushing back on it. And if they really do have persistent gender dysphoria, well, then you simply not immediately affirming it won't make that go away. But there's a lot of confused kids who just see something on TikTok or other kids in their class make an announcement. And that social phenomenon is exactly why it's important for doctors and for therapists and counselors to be able to talk to you about this stuff and not have their viewpoint. Because that was part of the Supreme Court case, was that they didn't just say you can't talk to kids about gender identity. So they said you're allowed to talk to your patients, but only if you essentially adopt the progressive view. So they imposed a viewpoint onto the therapists and the counselors who are regulated in Colorado, and other states have similar laws that will be reevaluated. And so that was also part of the First Amendment analysis, that laws regulating medicine are legitimate, but they're supposed to be viewpoint neutral, not enforcing an ideological consensus. But that's what these laws did. And it was so blatant that you had 2 Democratic appointed justices joining on in the ruling. So that's how you know it's not some doomsday scenario. It's common sense and just upholding the law.
If anybody has any questions from you or Brad, we are taking calls at 833-3-DR-DREW. But I get it on the gender side, but on the sexual orientation side, was it also off the rail there? I mean, because again, I worry that it's going to leave, I'm sure not just me, lots of people are worried this is going to leave room for some of these, what we used to call conversion therapies, but there can be conversion light therapies that could be look, if somebody comes into the room with any orientation about what the outcome is supposed to be, I'm going to make this kid straight, I'm going to make this kid whatever, that is not practicing medicine anymore. And so is this going to leave open the door to that kind of stuff?
Well, so one thing is you see a lot of like influencers or progressive commentators and Democrats invoking like the Supreme Court just legalized conversion therapy, like nausea inducement and shock therapy. Yeah. None of that's true. It only applies to talk therapy. Now, we can get into the nuances of whether a therapist should be allowed, because part of the problem was the law defined not just talking to about changing your identity, but also your practices. And sexual practices, wanting to change that is different than, for example, saying we're going to turn you straight. But for example, and this is the kind of thing that I don't agree with, but I understand that maybe people have a legal right to do. If you want to go to a Christian counselor who's going to tell you that as a gay person, God calls on you to be celibate and abstain from same-sex relations, listen, do I agree with that? No. But do I think you probably have a right to do that? I guess. So that's the only kind of thing that could potentially be back in play here is talk therapy.
I get what you're saying, and it's understandable, and it's challenging territory. I got to admit, this is rough going. This is why we have a constitution, right? It's why we have a Bill of Rights trying to navigate these things, and why we have a Supreme Court. And I get it, but it is. I forget what my fear was, but yeah, go ahead and finish your thought. Maybe it'll occur to me in a second.
Oh, I was just saying that lumping these laws together for both gender identity and sexual orientation was a mistake. When they were passed, really nobody was thinking about trans identities and therapy with gender. It was just kind of lumped in there, but it's really something very different. When people talk about the studies showing conversion therapy is harmful and doesn't work, they're absolutely correct. But those studies are about sexual orientation conversion therapy. They're not about gender identity. There's very little research or evidence about that. It's just fundamentally a different thing. And I think the core of the problem here was just like lumping this into the same bill and treating them interchangeably when in fact they're very, very different. Not a lot of people, and I don't know, you could maybe talk about this, but like not a lot of people are confused and think they're gay and then realize they're not. you kind of actually either are or aren't. I mean, never say never. There's billions of humans.
No, that's
whereas something as nebulous as gender identity and how you feel inside and all these kind of identities and pronouns and the new acronyms they're coming up with is not the same thing. And in fact, a lot of people do actually outgrow gender dysphoria when they go through their birth, sex, puberty. If they're not, put on the chemical pipeline and given puberty blockers, that's just not the case with sexual orientation. So treating them as the same or interchangeable was a big mistake. And these laws absolutely did that. So they were always kind of going to be a problem.
Yeah, what you like is a very different topic than who you are and what your identity is. And it's interesting to me, I was just thinking for a second here about hallucinogenics and their popularity. One of the great concerns I have about hallucinogenics is it changes people's character and identity. That's a profound thing. And we just go, oh yeah, they seem happier now. No. They were not in control of these changes. A chemical changed their brain and that changed who they are. And that whole area of identity needs to be highly protected, from anything that takes over the process from the patient. And I'm not saying the patient has to be affirmed all the time, but the patient has to be involved in the process where they're constantly part of it rather than it being taken over by a person with an ideology or a pill or a chemical that affects identity. It's a real serious problem that very few people kind of dig into right now. You were in front of Congress. Tell me about that.
Oh, well, that was years ago now, but it was during the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns. And I was a very early critic of this. So I did testify before the Senate Small Business Committee. It must have been 2021. It feels like ancient history now. But I talked about how harmful these lockdowns and these school closures were and this huge uptick in like suicidal thinking among young adults and all of this kind of thing that we were just told, trust the science. And I am very much not somebody who's a conspiracy theorist. I don't have a tinfoil hat. I don't distrust everything Dr. Fauci ever said, but I'm also not going to just blindly accept it. And so I was a little bit on the earlier side in terms of journalists reporting on the harms of some of these things. And you really, you did get quite attacked for that. I don't know what your experience was, but like the mainstream publications, like The Atlantic, they accused Georgia, I think it was the state of Georgia, of human sacrifice for rolling back lockdowns. It's like you really were accused of endangering people. If you question this stuff, which has trade-offs. My background is originally in economics, is what I studied in college. That's what they teach you. Everything in life has trade-offs. So even if your policies do prevent X number of infections or deaths, well, they're going to cause a lot of other consequences that can lead to deaths or ruin lives. So there wasn't nearly enough conversation about that. It was just almost a blind cult-like mantra of listen to the experts, even though what they were saying kept shifting and clearly wasn't purely scientific, but was also politically motivated.
Yeah, in medicine, we call that risk reward. You have to always, informed consent, risk reward. We did none of that. And Francis Collins said that publicly. They took no risk reward into consideration. That is disgusting. And New York Times took off after me a couple times, I think. And you need to, I don't know if you've educated yourself on this, but you're a perfect person to be reading about mass formation and true believers. You and I are in this group. Mass formation is something that comes upon human populations on a regular basis. I thought it was something that only happened in the mid-20th century. Turns out it happens throughout history, just happened here in the world. And about 10% of people, in the face of people doing the kinds of things you were describing, canceling people, accusing people of horrible things. By the way, if you did that during COVID, you would have been a prison guard in 1939. That's what you would be. You need to look at yourself and recognize that would have been your role. Prison guard, putting Jews in the ovens. That would have been you. So that the people that did that are what are called true believers. And they make up about 20% of the population. 70% just wants to be left alone. 10% like you and me are going, what? Hold on a second. This doesn't seem right. We need to study the true believers more. There's a book out. Have you read the book True Believers?
No, I should.
It's a firsthand account by a guy that was just observing. And man, he nails it. He's not trained in anything particular, but his writing is beautiful, and his observations are just penetrating. And I thought, wow, we all need to understand who the true believers are, how this happens to people, and then how we bat them away when they come around again. Because throughout history, they have tremendous potential to do harm. They could also be good, right? They can be a true believer in a positive way, but mostly they do tend to do harm. And even the true believers in a positive way need to be held to account. They need to be like, some of their enthusiasm needs to be dampened. So, Brad, what are you working on now? Where can we find you?
Well, I host the Brad versus Everyone podcast, where I cover basically media insanity, online drama, and controversies. And that's listen to it on any podcast platform or on YouTube is the number one place to find the show.
The True Believer book, given that's what you're focused on in your podcast. And by the way, I'll happily come on anytime we can organize it. I look forward to it because your thinking is so good and so clear, and so I just appreciate people that are thinking about things and not just reacting to things. And you're not afraid to have an opinion, and you're not afraid to look at things in a unblemished fashion. But I think you would enjoy that True Believer book. It's not a super enjoyable read, but you'll see familiar figures in there and go, oh, that's what that is. Thank you for being here, Brad. I appreciate it. I'll see you again soon.